Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being with us for our season 5 of the ISU UMN Research and Winemaking webinar series. So that's a series we started 4 years ago now, and we decided to provide it to you again this year. So thank you very much for being with us today. We hope you will enjoy it and you will develop knowledge and skills to be used in your vineyard and winery. So I'm Dr. Aude Watrelot. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist of enology at Iowa State University. And I'm co-hosting this webinar series with Drew Horton, my friend and colleague who is a research specialist of enology at the University of Minnesota's Grape Breeding and Enology Project. So before starting the webinar, it's being recorded. So the webinars that were recorded over the past 4 years are already available. The recordings are available on YouTube. I'm going to share the link in the chat box in a few minutes. Also, if you have any questions during any of those presentations, make sure you use the chat box. So that's that icon that you might find at the bottom of your screen. If you click on the 3 dots, that's where you should be able to see that. So make sure you type all your questions you have, and we will answer them at the end of both presentations. At the end also of the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to complete a Quadtrix survey about how we did today and what we will need to change for future webinars. So please take a few minutes after the webinar just to complete it. So today we will have 2 presentations. Dr. Maria Pilar Saenz-Navajas from Instituto de Ciencias de la Vid y del Vino in Spain. So it's pretty late for her. Will present some of her research and expertise on aroma compounds in wines and their interaction with non-volatile compounds and their impact on the sensory perception of wines for about 25 to 30 minutes. Then Dr. Miguel Pedroza from California Polytechnic State University, also called Cal Poly, is going to explain the importance of sensory evaluation of wine and the human sensory responses to wine quality for about 25 to 30 minutes as well. After the presentation, we will discuss and answer any questions you have with grape and wine industry members, Doug Frost, who is one of the 4 master of wine and master sommelier in the world, and Hannah Hanlon from Daughters Vineyard and Winery in Minnesota. But let's start with the present of Dr. Maria Pilar. So,
hi. I'm gonna try to share with you.
Yeah.
I don't know if.
So,
oops.
Yep. So Dr. Saenz-Navajas has a bachelor degrees in chemistry and enology from La Rioja University in Spain. She went on to complete a PhD in 2011 on wine sensory interactions and non-volatile sensory active molecules driving wine quality at the same university. Her PhD involved innovative work on sensory interaction on wine by construction, deconstruction strategies, combining sensory and chemical science. She was a postdoc fellow at the Center for Flavor and Feed Sciences in Dijon, France, from 2011 to 2013, where she acquired expertise in sensory and consumer science. She visited the University of California, Davis, with Professor Waterhouse in 2016, and the University of Adelaide in Australia with Professor Jeffrey. From 2013 to 2020, Dr. Saenz-Navajas worked at Universidad de Zaragoza at Laboratorio de Análisis del Aroma y Enología with Professor Ferreras, where her research was focused on the development of conceptual, instrumental, and methodological tools for the modeling of flavor. Since 2021, she's tenured research scientist at the Spanish National Research Council and developed her research at the Institute of Grapevine and Wine Sciences in La Rioja, Spain, where in collaboration with her former lab at University of Zaragoza, continues her research line following a multidisciplinary approach focused on modeling wine flavor from sensory active molecules and trying to understand how these molecules interact with the consumer to form the overall perception by employing strategies derived from cognitive psychology, chemistry, and enology. That's a full description. Great. All right. So Maria Pilar, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Odd. I don't know if you can you see correctly the presentation? Yeah,
Okay.
perfect. So first of all, thank you, Odd, for letting me show in our last work. One of our lines of research is focused on consumer and understanding perception, expectations, and how they are linked to wine typicality. This time, I won't talk about sensory active molecules, but rather more I will try to show you the key elements of wine perception, how expectations shape perception, and its link to wine typicality. First of all, I'd like to show you where I come from. Our institute is located in the north of Spain, in the region of La Rioja, where wines, both red and white quality wines, are produced. Our institute is situated on the outskirts of Logroño, which is the capital city of La Rioja. Since 2015, we are located on an estate of more than 40 hectares, where vineyards and olive and almond trees are cultivated. These later crops are grown 100% organically, and vineyards are increasing in percentage of ecological production. The ICVV has the goal of generating new knowledge and technologies in viticulture and enology, which can be the base for technological development and innovation within the grapevine wine production sector, which is an economic sector that is inherent to the Spanish agriculture and culture. As you can see, we work in a very nice place, so all of you are invited to visit us whenever you have the opportunity. Our institute's facility include experimental wine cellar, instrumental service, and plant resources. Some photos here of our experimental winery, which is full equipped with also we have the opportunity to scale wine production in any of the stages of wine production. And we have state-of-the-art equipment at our disposal. The last acquisition, the high-resolution MS, which is giving us a lot of joys in projects where we want to understand the chemical basis of certain analogical processes, but also the perception of flavor. There are also plant resources managed by the Department of Viticulture with greenhouses, growth chambers, variety collections, accessions collections, genetic tools, and experimental plots. The institute consists of two main departments, enology and viticulture. Our group belongs to the enology department, and we are the, as Odd says, the laboratory for flavor analysis and enology. In this occasion, I will start by, through the presentation, I will do mainly with three blocks. In the first one, I will deal with the formation of perception, theory of perception, talk about typicity and examples on how we can define typicity and more specifically regional typicity. To begin with, I will give a brief overview of the key elements involved in perception in general, in wine perception in particular. So classically, perception has been conceived as a modularized set of systems relatively independent of each other. Like here, you can see that vision, taste, smell. According to this view, we would receive separate information from different sensory modalities, vision, smell, taste, and mouthfeel, and add them together to have a global perception. However, this has become clear in recent years, this view is quite reductionist, and we know that perception is more complex than the sum of individual stimuli. First, the existence of correspondences between sensory modalities indicates that perceptual components are not independent. We see here, this is a picture of a brain. We know that there's sensory primary areas which are separated from each other. Vision, smell, and taste have their own and independent areas of activation. However, all of them are connected at the same time at the front part of the brain. For example, so these correspondences are very good illustrated with this image. If I show you those two pictures and I ask you which one is a booba and which one is a kiki, most of you will tell me that the round shape is a booba and that the angular one is a kiki. This is because there's a correspondence between shapes and sounds. In a more recent vision of the booba and kiki experiment, Metatlas showed that children associate the round shape to vanilla scent and calming emotions, and the angular one to lemon and scent and arousing emotion. In addition to this correspondence between the senses, it is also relevant to highlight that there are two mechanisms involved in perception. The first one is basically analytical. It consists of independently identifying the individual elements of the objects. As you can see here in these pictures, we are able to recognize parts of the objects, the circles, the 2 points, or the semicircle. But there's also a configural system which recognizes larger configurations. The bottom line is that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, like wine is more than the sum of the molecules which constitute it. That is why we are still far from modeling sensory perception from chemical composition, because the individual chemical parts will never, or will, I won't say never, but at this moment, these elements, individual elements, don't allow us to decipher this configurational perception. That's to say that the whole is more than the sum of the parts. That is, while we are drinking a glass of wine, sensory active molecules reach our receptors and generate individual signals that are integrated in our brain to form flavor. In this first step, the analytical mechanism mainly governs perception, which is called bottom-up mechanism. Bottom-up because it comes from the bottom, from the senses, and goes up to knowledge, to the thoughts. But at the moment that the sensations are generated in our brain, cognitive processing takes place, interpreting the perceptual signals based on consumers' history, memories, and previous experiences. In this second step, the sensations generated in the bottom-up mechanism are processed, are interpreted, and in this second step, which is mainly governed by the so-called top-down processing, top coming from the thoughts to the sensations, to the senses, there's as interpretation of the sensations produced or generated in the bottom-up processes, and then this interpretation of sensations we call perception. The top-down and bottom-up processing are always working in parallel, and the top-down signals modulate the incoming signals by creating expectations in These concepts are easy to understand with this visual example. For example, here, if you scan this image, you will see black and white patches. Our brain is following an analytical approach, and we can only see, most of us can only see white and black spots, but maybe some of you are able to see a meaningful image. If I help you to extract a meaningful information from the picture, in which the face of a man can be seen, then this is to say that the bottom line is that our brain filters important information and organizes it in a meaningful, based on some general, in a meaningful way. Then, if we go back, you will be able to see the face of the man. The individual parts of the picture do not change. It's the same as the picture I showed you first, but you have merely begun to look at them in a new way, thus changing the way you perceive the image as a whole. Our brain filters important information and organizes it in a meaningful way. This is which is governed mainly by this top-down mechanism. And perception is a dynamic searching for the best interpretation of the available data. Another important element of perception are expectations, and you will be able to understand it with this visual example. Here, you can see two vertical lines and 3 horizontal lines. But if I put them in this context, you will probably say that this is a B, right? But in this other context, most probably you can say that's a 13. So this is to say that expectations shape actual perception. In summary of this first section, overall perception is not the result of the sum of individual stimuli. Top-down signals modulate the incoming signals by creating expectations, and expectations and experiences, which come mainly from this top-down mechanism, influence how we interpret incoming information. Once I will follow with the next concept, which is typicity. I will try to define it and link it to the first section, to perception. Varietal typicality is defined by Wendy Parr as how well a wine matches expected characteristics for particular grape variety. You already see here how expectations will shape our perception of a wine when we are trying to identify its varietal typicality. But there's also typicality is also defined in a context of regional or geographically related typicality. And this is defined as the originality, uniqueness, and reputation of a product from a terroir or geographical location. I will focus from now on this second, regional typicality, which is, we know that it's shaped by natural factors like soil, climate, plant, but also by human factors, including cultivation techniques or winemaking techniques. Origin modulates the experienced, expected, and thus perceived quality of a wine. We know that greater congruence between experience and expected sensory signals leads to a greater perceived quality. So we have here a very interesting tool to shape or to increase, to modulate the perception of our wines. I talked here about regional typicality, but we can talk about winery typicality or I don't know if you are more in regional aspects of in USA or in your regions, but otherwise you can focus on winery typicality. And the first question is, why is it important to define the sensory typicity or typicity of a wine for a region or a winery? First, the protection of origin. You know that European laws and our European wine production is mainly directed to the protection of origin by under denominations of origin or appellation in France. But the second point, which is much more important for me, is very important to define it, to communicate and to increase the congruence between expected and perceived properties, which will lead to higher quality perception of our wines. The definition of the typical sensory profile of a wine category of a wine region is not evident. But we know that there's some points, it has to, firstly, some common sensory characteristics have to be defined within a category in a specific region. And I illustrate here with different exemplars of wines illustrated in circles like this. And in the core of this bigger circle will be these common characteristics. But we cannot forget that sensory cues that promote the diversity must be preserved. That's to say that genuine sensory traits have to be preserved. Otherwise, we only have very technical and simple wines. This concept can be easily illustrated in terms of facial recognition features. As you can see here, the category of human face, which can be compared with the category of the sensory profile of a region. In the case of human faces, all they have common elements. They all have two eyes, a nose, a mouth, and two ears that allow us to identify the object belonging to the category of human faces. But the specific characteristics, that is to say the size, color, or distance between the individual elements, and the specific combination of their properties make each face unique. So this is the same idea for wine typicality, to preserve these common features which will make our wine to belong to a category of a sensory profiling of a region, but to preserve also these genuine traits or characters. So the objective of categorization is to obtain maximum. Categorization is a mechanism that we all follow when during perception, and the objective is to obtain maximum information with minimum cognitive effort. This is to obtain a simplified version of the word. This simplification concerns both the inductive aspects of categorization. This means the recognition of an object as belonging to a category, but also its deductive aspects. Deductive aspects relate to the attribution of an object of the characteristics of the category. So I will move on to the last part of my presentation, where I show you some examples of how to define regional typicity. I will show you one French and one Spanish example of definition following two different strategies. And example one, which is described by Larisse in 2020, which was published, and the objective was to identify the typicity of 6 terroirs. They called them from A to F. They didn't disclose which were the terroirs, most probably because they are, it's something related to confident aspects. But the 6 terroirs belong to Languedoc. Languedoc is in the south of France, in this Granais area, south of France. And here they identify the different traits of the extrinsic traits or characteristics of the 6 terroirs, and based on the soil, climate, varieties. You see that all of them have the Grenache or Garnacha Tinta and the yield. Okay. And then what they ask themselves, is this typicality, the typicality of these 6 terroirs based on a bottom-up or a top-down effect? Is it this meaning that is it really based on a sensory perception, or is made on expectations, or made on top-down effect? So what they did was to select from each of the 6 terroirs. They selected 10 wines from each terroir, and they also selected 4 outsiders, wines out of the terroirs. They used 1 panel for each terroir. The panel were winemakers, enologists, sellers, and journalists from the area, which really knew or were in these regions and knew or were able to score typicality in these regions. And then they asked them, imagine that you want to explain what is the sensory profile of a wine from terroir X, from A to F. Would you find this wine as a good or a bad example? So they had to score this exemplarity in this scale for all these 14 wines, the outsiders and the wines from the terroir. And what we observed is different aspects. We saw that terroir A, the wines that are out of the terroir are marked in green, and the ones from the terroir are in blue. And terroir A, B, C, D, E, and F. And this is the key concerns the ANOVA, so the significance regarding this exemplarity score. And what we observed that for terroir A, absolutely, there was a very significant effect, meaning that from a sensory point of view, people were able to separate wines from the terroir and out of the terroir. This meaning that these sensory traits could be identified. But a different effect was observed for terroir B and C, which we experts were not able to separate the wine from terroir from these ones from out of the terroir. Based exclusively on sensory perception. Obviously, in this experiment, they were not said if they belonged or not. It was only based on sensory perception. And then we have terroir D, E, and F that are significant, but let's say that are very in the limit of significance. This meaning that there could be here some reality in terms of typicality. For B and C, of course, there's no typicality, but yes, we could probably find something out from D to F. But the best one was terroir A. And then the second example was the evaluation of typicality of wines from Rioja. You know that Rioja, which is in the north of Spain, has 3 main subregions: Rioja Alta, Rioja Alavesa, and Rioja Oriental. Rioja Oriental is more in the south, and Rioja Alavesa and Rioja Alta are more in the north of Rioja region. And these are regions that, as for the French terroirs, they are identified in the label, the origin of the wines coming from these different regions. And in this case, we didn't use an exemplarity score, but we asked them to carry out a sorting task with 30 wines. The 30 wines from the denomination origin Rioja, 10 from each of these 3 sub-regions. And then we asked 30 winemakers from Rioja. In front of you, you have 30 wines coded with a 3-digit code. We ask you to taste them and to group them based on their sensory similarity. That is to say, similar samples. So all the wines were presented simultaneously, and they had to make groups on the table based on the overall similarity. Similar wines will be put together in the same group, and different wines will be put in different groups. They could form even groups of only one sample. And what we observe here, you have the projections of the wines on the plot. The Rioja Alta wines in blue, Rioja Alavesa in orange, and Rioja Oriental in green. What we observed was a clustering of an effect related to in the second dimension. We observed that green wines, which are more on the top part of dimension 2, however, Rioja Alavesa in orange and Rioja Alta in blue are quite in lower scores of dimension 2. This makes sense because we know that Rioja Alta and Rioja Alavesa have mainly a climate influence from the Atlantic, and Rioja Oriental is mainly Mediterranean has a Mediterranean climatic influence. And then the second step, we asked them to carry out a free description of all the 30 wines. Then we extracted the descriptive terms, lemmatization, triangulation, and at the end, we had a description of all the 30 wines. And what we firstly saw is that the fresh fruit, because I forgot to tell you that all the wines were young wines in their first or second year. What we observed that the fresh fruit was the first descriptor, which was more suited for all the wines. No significant differences among the 3 regions, among the wines from the 3 regions were observed. And the next descriptors had a very lower percentage of citation. This is to say that here we identify the core of this core sensory attribute of this group of wines, but we also identify the sensory cues that promote this diversity of the overall region. So all the 3 regions share this fresh fruit, but they have individual sensory traits. We again, with this free description, we observed what we observed with the sorting task, that Rioja Oriental wines are quite different from Rioja Alta and Rioja Alavesa. So the salient differences are confirmed. But we also, with this strategy, we observed specific traits also for Rioja Alavesa and Rioja Alta. For Rioja Oriental, we observed that the wines were mainly ruby color, garnet, low color intensity, spicy, yummy fruit, and light in the mouth. For Rioja Alavesa, they were mainly purple in color, lactic, gummy, and floral aroma, and Rioja Alta were characterized by high color intensity, ripe fruit, balsamic mint, powerful tannin, and body and structure. So here again, coming back to this category recognition and this typicality where sensory common traits were the fresh fruit, but also we were able to see this diversity of the wines within the Rioja region. So it's time to conclude, and what I want to highlight is that don't forget that when we are tasting wines, both bottom-up and top-down processes occur, and that our brain is designed to see objects directly, not isolated features or parts, and also that typicity of the terroir is separated in both conceptual typicity, which is based on expectations and on this top-down mechanism, but also formed by this sensory perceptual typicity. Wine sensory profile can be seen as an object. This categorization of our product, which can be easily done by the sorting task, helps us to identify common features of a wine category, which is linked to this region typicity. And if we are able to define the typicity of our wines, we will be able to, firstly, technically, we will achieve wines that preserve this typicality. We will be able to better communicate our consumer, the market, what our wines are like. And this will allow our market, our consumers, to generate sensory expectations. And this, all these will lead to consistency between the perceived, sensory profile and the expected profiles. All this consistency between perceived and expected profiles will increase the perceived quality of wines. And to conclude, just so thanks again to the organizers of this webinar, and also to all people part of our team in the Instituto de Ciencias de la Vid y del Vino in La Rioja, our team in Universidad de La Rioja, and which are mainly leading this bottom-up mechanism, this sensory description and chemical description, and that my collaborators mainly working in top-down mechanism, Dominique Valentin, Eber Rodriguez, and Pablo Alonso and Eva Parga. And thanks all the institutions that have made possible this investigation, and all you for hearing me and listening to me all these 30 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Pilar. That was absolutely fascinating. A few quick comments. I'm definitely going to come to Spain someday, and I want to come visit you. I really, what a beautiful picture of that experimental winery. I'd love to see that. And I've always, you used a term early on talking about perception, about the whole is more than the sum of the parts. And I've been saying that about wine for a long time. And so it was nice to hear you say that. So thank you for this great presentation. As a reminder to all participants, please type any questions you have in the chat box. If you can't see the chat box on that lower ribbon of your screen, I believe if you press the 3 dots, the chat box will come up. All right, we're going to move on to the presentation by Dr. Miguel Pedroza. Miguel is Associate Professor of Enology at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, California, also known as Cal Polytechnic University, where Miguel teaches winemaking, fermentations, and general education courses related to wine and viticulture. Prior to Cal Poly, Miguel was Assistant Professor of Enology at Fresno State University, also in California. He's interested in how wine aromas are developed in grapes, transformed by winemaking techniques, and how they evoke emotions in consumers. Born and raised in Monterrey, Mexico, Miguel holds a doctoral and master's degree in enology from the University of Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, and a food engineering degree from Tec de Monterrey, also in Spain. No, that would be in Mexico. He conducted postdoctoral research in neuroimaging at the CNRS in France and has done research and professional internships in Piacenza, Italy, the Jura and Bordeaux in France. He's also been a wine judge at national and international wine competitions since 2014. Miguel is passionate about tasting, learning, teaching, and traveling for wine. Miguel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Drew and Odd, for the invitation. Before I start, can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, your screen looks great. We can hear you well.
All right, perfect. So yes, thank you again for the invitation to share some of the things I've been studying for a few years now. And today I am going to talk to you about emotions as a new quality parameter in wine, which is also derived from a review that I did a couple of years ago, and you have the QR code in there if you want to access that. It has more references and examples there. So just to get started with the presentation, as just to give you an idea of where I am, I recently came on board at the wine and viticulture program here at Cal Poly, where I was very fortunate to walk into a state-of-the-art facility for commercial winemaking and for research. Here you have a couple of images of how the center looks like, the Justin and J. Lower Center for Wine and Viticulture. And here I'm hoping to contribute to the already outstanding effort from current faculty and staff on doing research, applied research for wine and viticulture. So to get started, I'm going to start asking a very simple question, which is why humans consume wine. And if you are here because you also produce it, it's very likely that you have at some point in your life experienced something like this, which for many is a pleasurable experience. It's a memorable moment, or it's a reward. Experiencing wine creates something inside, and maybe the wine bug, right? Many call it that way. And it's certainly something that motivates humans to keep producing it and consuming it for many, many, many years. So on the other side, why humans do not consume wine, these example can also happen. And of course, these might be because people is not interested in wine, or they are disappointed as just maybe a mismatch of expectations. Some actual disgusting sensory feeling, or maybe you prefer other beverages. Regardless of that, there's something about wine that motivates this attractiveness or repulsion towards it. So what makes wine pleasing and how is pleasing created are important questions that I think in research we have been trying to answer, and there's always partial answers to them. It's so broad and big, but what makes wine pleasing, Maria Pilar did an outstanding example explaining what makes wine unique and also pleasing. And what we know is that the very basis, wine is mainly water and ethanol, right? It's the majority of the composition is that. And although consumers are attracted to ethanol, that's not the primary reason why we are into wine. And it's really flavor compounds that constitute a very small amount of the composition that create that pull, that attractiveness, or that pleasantness. And there's been many molecules characterized over several years, and we have a vast, a fairly sizable amount of knowledge on how vineyard cultural practices, varieties, typicity, winemaking processes create or are able to transform different pigments, odorants, tastings, and they all contribute, or the main message here is that from all this wealth of molecules, these molecules are able to interact with our senses, the vision, the sense of smell, the sense of taste. There are all primary senses in wine. They all come from this diversity of molecules. So, and what we understand is that the collection, the overall impression of all these elements, this chemical or chemosensory stimulus, create flavor, and that is related to the pleasant sensation or the pleasantness level of different wines. So to dive deeper into this concept of pleasantness, what is pleasant? Well, the dictionary defines as the quality of being enjoyable, attractive, friendly, or easy to like. And one more question would be, how do we measure pleasantness? And there are different approaches. The classic approach has been to provide panelists or tasters with a stimuli, which is wine, and has all of these different dimensions: vision, taste, smell, even sound. And then we can ask for a response that very frequently we use scales, such as this discontinuous scale, which is a liking scale with 9 levels. So this is the traditional paradigm to study perception of wines. And in the how do we measure pleasantness, all of these scales are also known as explicit measurements. There are continuous, discontinuous scales, but I'm here not to talk about these explicit measurements, but regardless of which explicit technique you're using, these techniques require consumers or tasters to introspect, to look into themselves and self-assess the stimulus in questions, in this case, wine. And it is a cognitive process that relies on your own representation of that stimulus, which is that introspection. And it also requires consumers or tasters to translate that mental state and into a number that ultimately it's written down outside of the consumer body, right? And one of the challenges of these methods is that they are prone to bias. And Maria Pilar also made a very strong point on how expectations can create some bias in the perception of these bottom-up signals, right? The primary chemosensory stimulus. Here you have an example of an already concluded research, but manuscript still in preparation, where we provided consumers and wine industry professionals with pure odorants. And you can see the names of the, odorants down here. And these odorants, most of them complied with the expected classification into pleasant and unpleasant aromas. However, when we evaluated if one of these odorants was rated differently between consumers and professionals, well, we found 3 examples where the pleasantness scale was slightly different for consumers and professionals. In this case, acetic acid, dimethyl sulfide, and strangely, beta-ionone, where professionals perceive the compound as positive, whereas consumers consider the compound as negative. This was without the context of wine. It was just the pure odorants, but it gives you an idea of how that cognitive information, the training in this case, can create a different perception of just pleasantness, very, very, very specific stimulus. Another example of how beyond cognitive aspects is on using still the pleasantness scale, in this case a hedonic scale, is the effect of gender on ratings of wines. In this research, experimenters presented 6 different wines and asked men and women to rate how much they like the wines. And what you can see here is that women were actually able to, or would provide very differentiated ratings for at least 3 groups of wines, whereas men seem to just like wine homogeneously regardless of. So this speaks about how gender can also be a factor in how this perceived flavor of wine ultimately lands into consumers' judgments. So something is happening between this stimuli and response model. And what we know is that, well, there are processes happening in the middle before we get to this response that are important to be figured out. And that those processes in the middle are sensation, where everything starts, yes, with the stimuli, the chemosensory molecules that interact with their senses, and these bottom-up signals will eventually travel to different regions in the brain. To, after all of this computation is done, that's when the ultimate judgment and even reactions will end up happening, or things that we can observe. In the particular example of olfaction, one of the interesting things about olfaction is that, let me use my pointer, make sure they have. So one of the interesting things is that once volatiles reach the olfactory epithelium and they're condensed in the olfactory bulb, this signal travels to very specific brain areas, such as the piriform cortex or the primary olfactory cortex. And after it reaches this point, the signal will keep moving into areas such as the amygdala or the entorhinal cortex, where, for example, the amygdala is known for processing emotions or hedonicity and intensity. Entorhinal cortex related to rewards. This olfactory signal can also travel to the hippocampus, which is one of the hubs for memory, or anatomical areas in the brain for memory. And ultimately, the olfactory signal can reach through different ways the orbitofrontal cortex, which is this frontal part of the brain where decision-making is known to happen, multisensory integration, that is blending the different senses, and where cognition, things that we know, things that we're expecting, will also play and shape that flavored image that we're creating in our brains. So beyond the brain, we know, and this is probably the full pathway, the full pathway from bottom to up. After this part of the brain creates or represents that external stimulus, there will be responses. And those responses will also travel to other parts of the nervous system, such as the peripheral autonomic nervous system, where the parasympathetic system will start controlling what the body's, how the body's reacting. For example, decreasing stress hormone, increasing saliva stimulation, modifying the heart rate. And then on the other side, the sympathetic nervous system can regulate kind of in the opposite sense, increasing stress hormone, inhibiting saliva production, increasing heart rate. So there are a number of responses that the body will produce after stimulation has happened and has been noticed by a taster. So, and it turns out that we can measure those responses using what is known as implicit methods or biopotentials. These biopotentials are physiological signals. And one of the interesting things about these physiological signals is that they bypass cognitive processes, or in many of them are subconscious reactions of the body to the stimuli such as wine, flavor, aromas, tastes. Among some of these signals, we can find electromyography, which is or will be targeting to measure muscles, specifically in the face. Heart rate, we can also measure that with electrocardiogram, and of course we'll observe at the heart rate variability, and electrodermal activity, which is the measurement of sweat secretion in the hand or other body parts. So all of these are actually changing as a function of stimuli. And what we know is that wine flavors can make changes in these physiological signals. So tracing back that concept of bottom-up, what we have seen so far is that wine flavor molecules and tasting or cognitive aspects will end up shaping the appraisal, the perception of chemosensory stimuli, and that cognition, emotions, memory will all play a role into shaping that flavor perception of wine, mainly higher cognitive areas of the brain, which is this rainbow region here. Once that image is created and multisensory integration has happened, tasters can start making value-based decision making preference, making a rating of the wines. And after they make those decisions, we know that from the implicit side, there will be changes in the body, such as facial expressions, electrodermal activity, heart rate, and ultimately there can be behavior to be expected. All a combination of both that bottom-up and top-down process. So beyond, to switch a little bit gears now, I want to talk about the concept of pleasantness. Of course, is very important because it kind of guides behavior, especially in consumers. And when talking about pleasantness, we cannot avoid talking about emotions. And here is one definition. There are different types of definitions. I'm just going to work now with one. So if emotions are defined as a pattern collection of chemical and neuronal responses that are produced by the brain when it detects the presence of an emotionally competent stimulus, such as an object or a situation. And to make a little distinction between emotions and feelings, feelings are the mental, and here I'm introducing conscious, representation of the physiological changes that characterize emotion. So there is a fundamental difference between feelings and emotion, where feelings are more a conscious process that results from physiological changes that will start coming or originating in the brain. So emotions from the very basic point of view have been divided by valence, into pleasantness, basically into positive emotions and negative. That is the basic classification of emotions. And if we keep digging into it, there have been some fundamental or universal emotions labeled by some, where we have love, joy, happiness, disgust, anger, sadness, and fear. So this is a little bit a more granular description of emotions. And a few years ago, Paul Ekman defined a system, a facial action coding system that defined emotions as a facial expression And facial expressions ultimately are movements of muscles. So according to this FACS system, specific activity of combinations of muscles will characterize emotions experienced by people. However, what we know is that these facial expressions are not always universal. It's not a human universal trait. Many of them are learned or they are cultural heritages. Regardless of this, what we know is that we can record this muscular activity. And here, let me see if this video is working. Maybe not. Let me see. Oh, there you go. So here's an experiment that we did a couple of years ago where we had participants sniffing through pure odorants, and we would be recording their muscular activity here, their heart rate and electrodermal activity. And what happens is that when they experience a stimulation, there are changes in their physiology that we can measure and record and try to understand. From the wine perspective, it's we can dissect first, separate, or one of the approaches has been to study stimulus separately and to understand which stimuli or odorants in this case can create a distinctive, for example, facial expression or changes in other physiological signals. And we will, of course, once we know that stimulation occurred, we can study this window of time when post the stimulus to see the effect of this. And here we have found preliminary, these are all preliminary results, it's unpublished research, I must say, but that using the muscular activity from the corrugator supercilii, so that those are electrodes that we place at this point, we were able to see, without asking participants for an actual rating, that the corrugator activity could differentiate or discriminate between at least one negative odorant compared to others. And then when we keep presenting these odorants on a third repetition, the discrimination, probably participants started learning that they dislike this particular aroma, that the frowning actually increased, suggesting that there is an increased aversiveness of this aroma. Then we went on and used the same odorants and spiked white wines to see if the effect held together. And what we found was some partial correlation with that. This 4-AP, it's 4-ethylphenol, that Band-Aid, that Brettanomyces contamination signal. So participants were still frowning harder compared to when we presented all of the other odorants in this white wine. Other signals that have observed or that hold potential on studying this heart rate, we were able to, we didn't reach any significance in here. Of course, the signals were very similar. And I must say, one of the challenges of using biopotentials is that this data is noisy because there are a lot of differences between each one of the participants. And now we're diving into the realm of physiology. But regardless of, some of these images may hold promise to be used to discriminate how different stimuli, such as different odorants, create a distinctive signature that we can associate with positive or with pleasantness. Another way of studying this has been the use of the circumplex model, first developed by Russell and Barrett in '99. And the main thing about this model is the use of 2 dimensions, pleasantness on the x-axis and activation or arousal on the y-axis, where along these 2 dimensions, discrete emotions can be arranged. And here, of course, if you notice, we're entering the domain of words. We're using these words to describe a specific feeling that consumers can report, self-report, or self-detect. And
Miguel, just 1 minute remaining.
yes. So this is important because we have, we can use these emotions to also attempt to discriminate specific qualities of wine. And of course, there are plenty of emotion words that can be used. There have been used, about 72 emotional terms have been used to describe wine. They differ between cultures. And one of the nice things about these words is that most consumers can relate to. You don't have to train consumers to tell them if they feel happy or not, or if they feel disgust, or if they love the wine. So as a wrap up, I want to reinforce the message that flavor molecules can evoke emotional responses. And some of them can be unconscious, and some of them can be conscious, and we can use them to characterize wines, and that maybe combinations of both implicit and explicit approaches can help us to better understand this pleasantness process in consumers. So since I'm a little bit out of time, I'm just going to jump to thank Aude and Drew for the invitation, and close with this quote that the taste or the flavor of wine is not in the glass or in the bottle, it's really in your head. And of course, I want to acknowledge the support from different organizations where I have done this research in the past. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Miguel, so much. Great presentation. This whole notion of bottom up and top down has really got me thinking. I think this is the first of the webinars we've done that really didn't talk about practical winemaking so much, but to me, an almost more important topic about our own perception, emotions, etc. Credit where credit's due. This whole subject was Aude's, wasn't mine. She suggested it, and I thought it sounded great. So it's been very enjoyable. As a reminder to all participants, please type any questions or comments that you have in the chat box, and we will answer them. So now we're going to be joined by Doug Frost, as Aude mentioned. Doug is actually one of only 3 people in the world who's a master of wine and a master sommelier. So I'm awfully glad he's here. I'm looking forward to hearing his comments on perception and typicity, that sort of thing. And our winemaker guest this session is Hannah Hanlon from Daughters Vineyard and Winery in Minnesota. Hannah is a second-generation Minnesota winemaker. Her father and her mother own a winery called Whitewater Wines in Plainview, Minnesota. And Hannah went off to UC Davis a few years ago and got her enology and viticulture degree. And then for a few years, she worked running the lab at Ridge Vineyards in California. Probably my first, or certainly my top 3 favorite California wineries. So we're glad to be joined by Doug and by Hannah. And Aude, do we have any questions in the chat box?
So we don't have any questions for the moment, but I do have some questions. But I think I would really appreciate if you can tell us your feedback and your perception about all those great presentations, Doug and Hannah. Have you considered all of that when you do judge of wine, or when you just taste your wine in the winery? What's your feedback?
Well, ladies first.
Indeed.
Oh, I was just about to say, Doug, you go first.
Well, whatever you wish.
Yeah, I can start. I took notes like I'm back in college. It was very interesting to take a step back from winemaking. I mean, I bottled wine this morning, so I'm very much on the production side of our winemaking, but do have to take a step back and think about all these things at time to time. So it was nice to take an afternoon and learn about this unique research. I mean, coming from UC Davis, Waterhouse, and Heyman are doing all types of awesome research on these types of things as well. But I don't think I had ever had a real conversation like this that bridged that gap truly between the sense and the reality. I know as far as my day-to-day practice, I know this is true. This is something that I force us to think of when we make decisions based on taste. So all of our winemaking decisions are based on taste. That's something that I learned from Paul Draper, and I just hold to it. But I know also tasting in the lab is very different than tasting at your home. So I do force us to make decisions based on the idea that a consumer is going to be drinking this wine with perceptions and with food or not, or an open mind or not. And when we then make any winemaking decision, we do need to keep those factors in mind. Any big winemaking decision, I try to make up bottles and send them home with my team. And you go have this with dinner, think about it, enjoy it with your family, and then let's reconvene as far as this winemaking decision. So for me, it was just really neat to know that there's actual research going on to not only try to define this in between, but really understand how do we get from point A to point B, and how do we measure it? How do we, are we using facial cues? How do we most effectively figure out how to make wine that people like?
And I think if I can just add something, I found that very interesting what you showed, Miguel, about the professional versus the consumer perception, because that's the main point. We are making wine, you are making wine for consumers to appreciate, but the perception they will have is really depending on, everything you mentioned about the environment, where they taste the wines, but also they don't have the same expectation as winemakers. And so how is the difference? That's good to see the difference between those two groups of people, even though we know that's different. That's always good to have a reminder. And it raised more questions, especially for the wines in the Midwest. But I'll let you finish.
No, that's right. That's a great point, because that is another thing we constantly have to remind ourselves. Not only are we tasting the wine in this sterile environment, not the way that the consumer is going to be drinking or tasting the wine, but also we're tasting the wine way over analyzing it, usually with all this extra knowledge and not necessarily going into it always with the what do people want. My boss likes to say that we make wine for Midwest housewives, which is it's what he says, but it reminds us to take a beat and think about what we like versus what consumers like, which can be very different. And it was interesting to see how few data points there were that were not, that the consumer and the professional were not different. I expected there to be more differences, I guess, in that study with consumer versus professional. So it would be interesting to see that taken further to, oak, tannin, different types of tannin, all the weird nuance that we know wine can have, how that is perceived by consumer versus professional. Even the appearance of the wine, the color, I'm sure different people have, I know I have an opinion on color that is based on my knowledge, and someone else might have an entirely different opinion based on their experience. Or closure. I really, have opinions about closures, and some people have different opinions based on different experiences. So I see there's some questions too, and I can shut up and let Doug say his 2 cents.
Thank you, Hannah. Yeah, Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Ode. Obviously, all of us are fascinated by the data that helps make clear how differentiated people's experiences are. And I think most frustratingly for those who are doing this kind of really critical research, Maria Pilar and Miguel, it's so difficult to pull one thread away and say, look how different this is when wine itself is this remarkable matrix. And exactly as Maria Pilar explained from the outset, it's a matrix that's built from more than simply what's in this glass. It's a matrix built from the glass, from the afternoon, from, or in Maria Pilar's case, the evening, and the people around us, and the day that we've had, and the expectation created by color and aroma, and a million different pieces that all form this matrix. So it becomes really, really, I think, such a challenge for us to understand how taste and preference is built, because there are so many different pieces that we have to try to reassemble in order to understand it. And certainly it's a moving target as well. I mean, I come back to Maria Pilar's research surrounding Rioja. It's always funny to me to discuss Rioja, because we could literally grab a particular cohort and say, what is your expectation of a Rioja? And the answer might be, well, I don't expect any Rioja to be fresh fruit. I'm waiting for Gran Reserva. I'm waiting for, the character of traditional Rioja as opposed to modern Rioja. And so my expectations are built upon a different set of criteria than may be measurable in this particular instance. So the whole thing is for me fascinating, because in my iterations as a teacher, so often, or examiner in the Master Sommelier and the Master of Wine program, I'm coming to a particular wine or category of wine with my own experiences determining what my expectation is. And my students, so often younger than me, because everybody anymore is younger than me, are not necessarily coming with that same set of baggage. So I think of an example I used the other day with someone, that a young sommelier showed me a Burgundy that she just couldn't stop raving about. And I was horrified by it, because it was probably close to 16% alcohol. And I thought, what the hell do you think Burgundy is? It was, I couldn't possibly say that to this person, but it came back to, wow, your expectations of this category and mine are remotely, acres apart. And how do we bridge that? And particularly, how do we bridge that, to come back to what Hannah's saying, I have this, one of the wines that we make at our winery is a Grenache, which is very light in color, very fruity, very primary, very simple in many ways. And when I show that to an older consumer, they're kind of horrified. And when I show that to a younger consumer, they're delighted, because it's like, oh, wow, this is so cool. This is exactly what I wanted. And how do you bridge that? And, it comes back to, you don't. Sorry, Hannah, you were going to say something, I think.
No, I'm just reacting and agreeing that I am with you.
How do we bridge those? But it certainly underpins everything that Maria Pilar and Miguel have said, which is that expectation is determinant in the perception ultimately, because I think, and maybe my cohort that I'm thinking about is smaller than the cohort that we should consider. My cohort is the person who picks up the glass and wants to come up with a qualitative response. It's like, this is good, this is okay, this is great, this is terrible. So they're determining a hedonic response and assembling all these ideas, but ultimately they're taking it to that place. And I suppose that's an accurate reflection of what consumers do, because they're going to decide, am I going to have a second taste? And that's going to be hedonically determined.
Yeah, I call that the Caesar response. I like it. Pretty. That's what I ask with my beginning students, is just have some sort of opinion. Even like and dislike is, now you're learning about your own perceptions and you're teaching yourself about your own expectations and what is pleasantness. One other quick thing, there is a question in the chat box, but I thought that graph, Miguel, on the gender differences among the 6 wines, I thought that was very interesting. And Hannah, you are making wines for Midwest housewives, and there's not a darn thing wrong with that. I don't know where I've seen this number, but or Doug, maybe you know. I mean, 75% of the wine purchased out there is purchased by women, and I don't think there's any doubt about that. And if I'm wrong, I'll be the first to apologize that I'm wrong. So there is one question. Have any of the presenters, Miguel, Maria Pilar, have any of the presenters come across the idea of a smell image? I'm not sure exactly. They put that in quotes, smell image. If so, how would you relate the concept to the neurosensory science versus consumer and practical aspects of wine tasting? Any comment, Miguel?
I can speak quickly about that. The concept of a smell image is not, it's out there. There's an actual review on that from neuroscientists. And so smells in the end, many times when we talk about smells, we're making a reference often to an object that we can see that has color. And so it's a multi-sensory percept that is not limited to just what we feel when we are sniffing or sensing something through the nose. So we use that all the time, the smell image, in combination with memory. And we're trying to make that match that Maria Pilar was talking about, those expectations. If you say that wine is supposed to smell like bananas, well, you have a reference of bananas, but and depending how rich your experience with bananas and different colors, different maturities, different appearances, different varieties of bananas, you may have something, a small reference or a very wide reference. So it applies in the sense of how to winemaking, in the sense of how granular can be the descriptions of consumers, and speaks as well on the experience of them. In the example as well of cassis, most people in most countries have no idea what cassis is, although it's very referenced in books and many places, and we don't know. It's a blue fruit. Some people don't even know that it's a blue fruit or black fruit. So those senses need to resonate with consumers to actually have a meaning and to create that image or an expectation. And probably Maria Pilar can expand as well on that.
So we know that, we can think of a wine as a flavor object, and the object is formed by different elements. The different elements of the wine are the buffer properties, the buffer aroma, which are common aromas, which are common to all fermented wine beverages, and it includes all the fermentation pool of volatile compounds. And this buffer, if you smell it, is like just a vinous aroma. We call it like a wine-like, and it's common, but in the proportion of higher alcohols, alcohol esters, acetic acid, all this stuff, all this ratio can change among wines, but at the end we have a vinous aroma. And then on this buffer we build the aroma, and it's based on aroma vectors. We call aroma vectors to aroma properties. For example, we have aroma vectors formed only by one molecule, like TCA, the aroma, the cork aroma. With one molecule, you can just have a vector that it's breaking the buffer the vinous aroma and is providing you this mushroom-like or cork-like aroma, but we have other aroma vectors, like the vector of the esters, ethyl esters, that it's formed by 14 individual esters that all in cooperation form a overall fruity aroma. And imagine we can say that we have like 25 vectors, aroma vectors, that interact among them to form the overall aroma. So the thing is that this interaction between these aroma vectors is very complicated, and we still don't know what's happening in these interactions, because we have masking effects, we have enhancer effects, and this is why we are close to, but not, we cannot yet model flavor, because so there's the interactions among aroma vectors, but also among non-volatile compositions. So we have seen that like the same amount of 4-ethyl phenol, which smells like leather, with 30 ppbs, we can smell it so with a high intensity in some wines, but in others you will never smell it. So there's so physical and perceptual interactions that we are still far from being able to model sensory perception from chemical composition. And all these aroma vectors and with this buffer creates the aroma object. And the aroma object, which belongs to different category of wine. So for DOT, the aroma vector of Rioja, or the objective of, or the flavor object of Rioja wines are budded wines. So, I mean, the object is formed by expectations, but also from all his history and all his familiarity with Rioja wines, or the category of wines that we will talk. So,
thank you, Pilar. I have a question related to what you said. So how can we change the expectations of consumers? And I'm just thinking about, can we change the expectations of consumers related to the Midwest wine? Because so in the Midwest, we have a lot of varieties that are not grown in other countries that are resistant to the harsh cold winter we have, and they have really specific flavors, really specific aroma compounds. And if you say to a consumer that they're going to try a wine from, let's say, Iowa, they will automatically, without even tasting, they will automatically have a negative perception in mind. And so I'm wondering, can we change the expectation? Can we kind of cheat? So instead of saying you're going to taste a wine from Iowa, you just say you're going to taste a wine?
So we did some experiments with French, Spanish, Swiss, and Brazilian wines. So the very traditional, and everyone has in their mind what have ever tried this wine, and wine from Brazil or wine from Switzerland, no one knew what was that. So everyone what were the expectations, or which was the representation of wines from Switzerland or from Brazil. So as they could not infer quality, or they could not infer the flavor because they had never heard or taste such wines, they infer based on the country. So Brazil wines, what they came to their mind with sun was carnival or whatever, and from Swiss was acuity or watches or whatever. So when consumers don't have a priori about wine, what they infer based on the country or the region or whatever they have heard before. But all these expectations, so I think that are quite stable and very difficult to change. But expectations, from my point of view, is based on familiarity. Familiarity with our history, the history of the consumer who is tasting it, And this meaning that culture based on familiarity is a very, very important factor, and the level of expertise of the consumer. So as you said, of course, expert and naive consumers have nothing to do. We have in the middle highly involved consumers which share naive consumers and experts' expectations. But these two factors are fundamental and all are driven by familiarity. And yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
Oh, that's good.
I would add, if I could, I would just add, in the Midwest, we do have an opportunity because we're working with some new grapes, or at least we're working with grapes that people don't necessarily have, exactly to Maria Pilar's point, familiarity with. And to me, that's how we break sort of the mold, is to say, this is a new grape. This is something new. This is never, you probably never tasted this before. And to let them know that this is going to be not the same Sauvignon Blanc experience, or, whatever grape, we want to talk about. Itasca, is like nobody knows anything about it. So we get to start from scratch. They're still going to come to it with the baggage that Maria Pilar has described, that the idea, and as you've said, that the idea is, well, I've had all these wines before, they're always sweet. And it's like, well, this one isn't, and this is a new grape. Would you like to try that? And I'd love to believe, perhaps naively, that that's going to allow us to keep moving forward, because I do think we're moving forward.
Yeah, I would add that in 2 words, the answer would be blind tasting.
Yeah.
Because blind tasting is doing exactly that, removing those expectations, and if you put them together with the wine that the consumers are more familiar with, and they discovered by themselves without those expectations attached, that is a great opportunity. That contrast, they need to experience that to believe in it. So yeah, blind tasting would be a good strategy.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. We are running out of time. Sorry, that's a great discussion, and I wish we could continue because that's so interesting. But yeah, we have to finish. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating today, attending today the webinar. So before closing, I would like to mention the upcoming webinar. The future one is June 25. That's going to be about wine microbiology for acidity management. And then we're going to talk about alternative products in July, which is verjus and vinegar. So we are moving a little bit the main topic, but it's going to be interesting. Then we're going to talk about low alcohol wines in October, but then we still have a little bit of time, right? In November, we're going to talk about challenges of color management in wines. So feel free to register for those upcoming webinars. And so also, if you can take a few minutes to complete the Quatrix survey that is here on the QR code, or I'm going to share in a few seconds the link, but you will also receive an email to complete that survey. And so we will really need your feedback just to improve our webinars, to improve the knowledge, and to provide you everything you need to know for the upcoming season. And to finish, I would like to thank you very much, presenters. So Miguel, thanks very much. Maria Pilar, thank you so much for being late with us, staying awake. You're free to go to bed now. And Doug, thank you so much for your great discussion, and Hannah, same. Thank you so much. Thanks, Drew, as well. See you in a month. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for having me.